all of our observations take place strictly within our minds. Light and color and the visual universe is nowhere but in our brains. There's no color in the universe because light doesn't have color or brightness. Light is actually, or photons of light, are magnetic and electrical phenomena. They're pulses of magnetism and electricity. We can't see magnetism, we can't see electricity. So on its own, if we weren't watching that sunset with the beautiful sunset colors, that's not there. It's not even black. It's blank.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. I'm really excited for our show today, as I'm not really entirely certain of all these amazing topics that we're going to cover. Our guest is Bob Berman. He's one of the most widely read astronomers in the world. He taught physics and astronomy at New York's Marymount College. He's contributed to a number of scientific magazines. He produces and narrates his own radio show and has authored 8 books. He also just recently co-authored a book called Beyond Biocentrism, Rethinking Time, Space, Consciousness, and the Illusion of Death. I have the feeling this is going to be an amazing conversation. Bob, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashton.
So if we could start before we kind of jump into the meaty parts of the topics that you guys cover in your book, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how originally you got involved with astronomy, and then how you got involved with biocentrism and the creation of the book?
Well, astronomy just came naturally. I don't know if you believe that we all have a sort of destiny and life unfolds, or whether you think that we create our own future and make everything happen by careful planning. I'm of the philosophy, life is taught that it's really the former. And so I've always loved astronomy. My earliest memory was looking at the stars from, I don't know, a carriage or a stroller or something. I don't think I had language, but I was looking up and seeing stars and loved it. Learned the stars as an amateur, studied it at college, taught it at college. And so it's been a lifelong thing. And of course, being with first Discover magazine for almost 2 decades, and then Astronomy magazine every issue of the last quarter century. And this is probably not the place to roll out my credentials, but I'm the astronomy editor of the Old Farmer's Almanac. So I'm very, very involved with it on the public level. Now, biocentrism was something else. My books, I've had the same agent for over 2 decades. It happens to be the same agent of Stephen Hawking and Bob Lanza. And the first biocentrism book, I guess it's now 7 or so years ago, wasn't, nobody was really buying it. The publishers weren't interested. And so because we have the same agent, my agent asked me if I would take a look at it, whether it looked interesting, whether I could kind of fix it up. And it was interesting. And it also resonated with my own beliefs about life. And so I was happy to work on it. We eventually decided on a co-authorship, and that was the first one. And now this year, the second one came out, which I think is much better than the first.
Well, and it's quite a lofty undertaking. I mean, it's a book that's, even though there's the light moments and there's some nice drawings and things like that, it's taking on some very big human topics of, I mean, even the subtitle, time, space, consciousness, and death. I mean, those are some pretty big human topics and things of quite a different opinion on.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, Ashton, because, basically cosmology, the field of astronomy that deals with the universe as a whole, what is this whole thing? How was it born? Was it born? Does it have an end? Is it finite? Is it infinite? What's our relationship? In fact, what's the relationship between the living and the non-living? And did we just spring up by some fluke, by some accident, as the mainstream view has it? Was the universe just cold and dead and inert for the first, until 4.5 billion years ago when Earth formed, and then life formed another billion years later? Or is there some relationship between consciousness, and that's another thing. How does our consciousness fit? And so these, yes, you're absolutely right. These are huge questions that I think drives everyone when they read articles about cosmology. They're really after the answer to these things, and the answers so far have not been satisfying. I don't think anybody is satisfied by the Big Bang. Not to say it didn't happen, but as an explanation, the fact that the whole universe popped out of nothingness one Saturday morning, 13.8 billion years ago, and nobody knows how, nobody has a clue how that could have happened or what the antecedent conditions were, what caused it to happen. And then we're told it's expanding faster than the speed of light at a certain distance from us, and nobody knows what's beyond that point or how much of the universe lies beyond that, or how life began, or what consciousness is. I mean, we're observers. Everything we see is through the movie screen of perception, of awareness, of consciousness. How does that fit in? Well, so the science, mainstream science, does not even try to tackle that, which is honest, because they can't, because they don't really know how consciousness originated, if it did originate, or what the relationship is between that and the universe. So that's the broad palette that we have. That's the canvas for the book.
Well, and so perhaps we can unpack a few things here. And you were talking about the Big Bang and some theories of time. What's your view of time? And specifically within that question, how has the Judeo-Christian, or how have the Judeo-Christian religions impacted how we view time currently, at the very least in our Western world?
Well, yes, there's two very, very different views, and even scientifically, whether time really exists as its own standalone item, as Isaac Newton thought, and he was smart, or whether it's just something that we humans create in our minds as a way to organize the vast avalanche of electrical signals that are always going through our brains, and there's changes going on. So maybe time instead is something we create. It's like our numbering system. And if that's the case, then it certainly doesn't have any independent reality. We certainly couldn't travel through it, for example. And people like Immanuel Kant, in other words, other smart people, really thought that. And science, because that's what the book really comes down to, is not asking anyone to take any of this on faith, but science over the last 75 years has now firmly come down on time not being real as a standalone item. Now, how it relates, your question was how it relates to the Judeo-Christian thing. Well, that's very, the philosophy behind it depends upon whether you have a more Eastern slant, because Hinduism and Buddhism tend to see the universe as eternal and not having a natal moment, whereas the Judeo-Christian tradition bases everything on God. Now, we take no position on whether God exists or not. We're fine either way, whatever the reader wants to believe there. But if you do have a God, this is where time comes in, then that really supports time, because although we can't say how God came into the picture, God is presumably timeless or eternal. Nonetheless, in all the scriptures, he created Earth and the universe at a finite point. And so that argues for the existence of time.
And so I know in the book you guys talk about a lot of time in relation to the observer and things to that effect. How does the observer kind of feed into an idea of awareness? Or perhaps we could take a step back and say, how do you define awareness and explain what it is?
Well, that's the bottom line, isn't it, Ashton? I mean, if we see everything, if everything is perceived, all of our observations with our eyes or through our telescopes, all of our conclusions, all of this occurs, obviously, on the movie screen of consciousness, awareness. Duh, how could it be otherwise? Going back to George Berkeley, going back a few centuries, he would say that the only things we ever perceive are our perceptions. And then we just assume that our perceptions are based on some sort of independent universe that exists apart from them. But what we're saying, and this is all science-based, that's the important thing, that we're saying that in Beyond Biocentrism, that science has told us, especially with the advent of quantum mechanics, but even before that, that all of our observations take place strictly within our minds. We spend a whole chapter showing that light and color and the visual universe is nowhere but in our brains. There's no color in the universe because light doesn't have color or brightness. Light is actually, or photons of light, are magnetic and electrical phenomena. They're pulses of magnetism and electricity. We can't see magnetism, we can't see electricity. So on its own, if we weren't watching that sunset with the beautiful sunset colors, that's not there. It's not even black. It's blank. It has no color. We give it color. Now, this is not some kind of original thought. Even in the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada's handbook, Dr. Roy Bishop, one of the longtime editors, keeps writing that rainbows occur strictly within our skulls and things like that. But it's so long, that language with us individually has been saying that acting as if colors are something that's in front of our noses, that the visual world with all its brightness and shadows and all the rest are something that occurs externally to ourselves, in front of our noses. But it's very hard for most people to make that leap.
And is it because that they're perceiving, like, what they actually see color-wise is actually an interpretation of their senses, and that's what's giving them the perception of colors?
Well, yes, it is. But if you say to most people, that green tree over there, is that inside your brain? Is that inside your mind? Or is it out there, away from your body, independent of your body? Almost everybody will say, well, that's out there. And they think mistakenly that the eyes are sort of like clear windows that let in the colors that already exist in the world. People, even when they're given the science behind it, which is irrefutable, they can't escape, because it's a lifetime of habit, the idea that there is an external world independent of themselves. It's almost like the tree falls in the forest business, that exists even if they weren't watching, that green tree is out there even if no one's looking at it. So we spend a whole chapter showing, until it's inarguable, until nobody can dispute it, that color and light occur strictly in our minds. We create it. In other words, it's a correlative thing. Nature and we as observers go together in creating all that we see and experience in the visual realm. So that's a step. By the time we get to time and space and show that these things, too, are things that we create, they don't have any independent existence. Well, that's an important step, because when you see that time and space have no independent reality, you start to see that the very framework upon which we picture the universe, we all picture Earth as being separated from other stars, other galaxies. In other words, that space, the spatial realm, is one framework for the structure of things, for the nature of reality, and time is another. I mean, obviously, Earth started a certain time ago, and the Big Bang happened 13.8 billion years ago. And so time and space are needed for this structure of reality that everybody has, and that science basically uses. Only when we see clearly, and we spend about 3 chapters on this so that you can see it clearly through the eyes of science. You don't have to take anything on faith. That time and space do not exist except tools of animal perception. We carry them around like turtles with shells. We create space, we create time. And once you see that, you realize that you can't use this space-time framework as any kind of real grid for understanding the universe. Or, at minimum, that you need to understand consciousness and perception and awareness. And as if you have any doubts about that, we then present, especially the double slit experiment, but a variety of quantum mechanical experiments that show that the results depend on the observer, which is why John Wheeler, famous physicist, passed away a few years ago, famously said, no phenomenon is a real phenomenon until it's an observed phenomenon. So this is a big change, Ashton, from a time when we used to think that if we observed an electron or a photon moving in a certain way, we could confidently say, well, before we observed it, it must have been here, and before that, it must have been there. Now, physics says, no, the observation is the reality. The observation is the only thing we can trust, and we don't know for sure what anything was except when it's being observed. So this brings the observer really squarely into the picture, and our bottom line in biocentrism, which is nature and the observer are correlative. They go together. They're one and the same.
Well, so a couple questions are coming to mind. One, I kind of, as you're saying some of this stuff, I'm getting this image of the old movie series, or not that old, I guess, but the movie series, The Matrix, right? Where everyone's just sitting in these little tubes and they're experiencing this whole illusion of a life that doesn't actually exist. It only exists inside their head. Is that kind of, I mean, because where do we go from that space of, okay, well, it's not happening out there. Where is there then? Where is here? Like, where is it all happening?
Excellent question. Now, the difference from the Matrix is that in the Matrix, essentially, it wasn't real. What everybody was experiencing in the Matrix was a made-up fake world so that people would be passive and not squirm when they were actually sort of embryos being used for their electricity. They were actually somewhere else, and the world wasn't really real. It was a sort of the equivalent of a computer projection. No, we're not saying that at all. We're not saying it's not real. Everything you experience, the colors, the world that seems that surrounds you, it's real enough, but it's not separate from you. The tip of your fingers are no farther or closer than the tree that's out the window, because it's all happening within mind. Now, somebody might object and say, now, wait a second. My body ends with my fingertips, and that tree there or that neighbor's house, that's some distance away. And in fact, if I start to walk there, it takes me several minutes to get there, whereas my fingertips are right here. Because people don't realize that the fingertips, their fingers, are mental projections. They're images of your body and your skin that also occur within your mind. In other words, within your mind, nature has created a body for yourself, for you to experience, so you don't stub your toe, and so you can reach for that cheeseburger or whatever it is you're doing. And that image of your body, which is occurring in your mind, lets you walk, lets you navigate. But make no mistake, when you walk down the street, your body-mind is walking through your mind to a tree or a neighbor's house that's also in your mind. Nothing is really further away than anything else. It's all occurring as electrical signals within your brain. And you can't leave that. In a way, it's infinite. And it also produces paradoxes. Ashton, although biocentrism explains the science of the last century, explains what's going on so much better than the standard model, which is full of, and we spend 3 chapters showing why the standard model, don't go back and say, well, this stuff is really far out, biocentrism, but there's some things it can't explain. Because when you look at what the current reality is, as explained by mainstream science, it's full of these giant holes. What was the Big Bang? How did it form? What preceded it? We don't know that. What is life? How did it start? We don't know that. What is consciousness? That everything, okay, we can see that everything occurs within consciousness. But what is this consciousness? The mainstream science doesn't have a clue. Is the universe finite or infinite? Is most of it within view? Or is most of it beyond what we can see? We're where galaxies recede at the speed of light.
Well, there's also an interesting thing within this, and you guys do point on this in your book as well, but kind of tying this in of the difference perhaps between perception and either consciousness or awareness, and perhaps we could tie it into that, this concept of blind sight, and see how, like, as perception, we think of eyes, we think of that, but there are people that are being able to perceive certain things without the senses that we normally associate with. Could you explain some of that for us?
Paradoxes arise as soon as we start to think of other people's perceptions. And in biocentrism, we're left with some huge paradoxes. One of the reasons for that, I think, is that when we try to perceive reality or the universe or the totality of things, we're doing so with our minds, with our logic. And these use symbols. These use the words, which are always dualistic. They stand for things. The word water is not actual water. And so any way that we try to picture things as a totality, we run into contradictions and paradoxes. For example, we come to see that the sun really has no light and heat on its own, because light and heat are both things that require consciousness or an observer to experience. So, but on the other hand, how could our bodies even exist if we didn't have the nurturing light and heat from the sun to allow life to exist on Earth? So we end up concluding that although the sun, as well as the rest of the universe, exists within our minds, within our consciousness and our minds also exist within the universe. Each exists within the other. Now, can you picture this? I can't. It's really an impossible contradiction. And so people who come to these contradictions, you run into these whenever you're picturing, well, a blind person, what are they experiencing? If all is one, and that's what we end up concluding, then as soon as you try to go into another creature's experiences, you're already stepping out of the oneness. Now, the oneness is there. It's not negotiable. But how individuals relate to each other is another story, and it would take a whole chapter to even begin to explain that. All we say is that biocentrism does not answer every question. Just as Newton's laws, he believed in God, and his laws did not explain how God came into existence, how there could be this omnipotent being. And we didn't criticize him for it. What he did was he changed how we saw the universe, just as Einstein did. So biocentrism similarly makes everything much clearer. It works much better than the current model. But that doesn't mean that every question in philosophy, in metaphysics, and science can be answered satisfactorily. And all I would ask is that we'll just compare it to the existing model, where we have a universe that popped out of nothingness for reasons nobody can explain, is expanding faster than the speed of light, 13.8 billion light years away, where most of the universe is not within view. In fact, some think that the universe is infinite, both in spatial size and in inventory, and we can't picture infinity. Nobody can. Mainstream science can't explain how life began, what consciousness is, how consciousness began, or what the real relationship is between consciousness and the physical universe, except that we influence it because the experiments we do show that they're different when people are watching than if we're not watching. So the current model of reality is so full of holes and question marks and I don't knows that it's almost useless. It's why nobody's really satisfied with it, because it doesn't really explain anything. And so the biocentric view is much, much, much clearer and makes a lot more sense, but it doesn't answer every question.
Well, and I find it quite interesting that there are so many parallels with a number of different, whether we call them Hindu or yogic philosophies, in terms of how oneness then gets expressed as the many. And some schools talk about a veiling of the observer in the same way you're talking about. We can't really conceptualize infinity, and well, if consciousness is infinite, well, how do we have a limited experience to experience something? And so it talks about how there's a veil that is put over, so I now perceive essentially just the stimulus coming from this limited sense of mind and body, but of course still having access through, and that's what so many of the yogic practices are about then re-expanding to that whole, which is an experience beyond mind. You can't really explain it because, again, explaining it would use words, and words, as you said, are symbols that we're using to define something in this limited space. So it's all very, very fascinating, of so many of the parallels between what science is coming up with and what sages and yogis have been talking about, at least similar stuff for thousands of years. I want to kind of move this towards the question of death, because I know it fits in. I know it's something you guys talk about in the concept of biocentrism and everything else. What do you think happens when someone dies?
You mean experientially for that person?
Or any way that you would seem to want to answer, because I know you guys have a particular idea, or at least from the book, it says that if time isn't existing, then what is time after death and things like that. So I'm just curious to hear your opinions on what death is. Maybe not what happens, but what is death?
Okay, well, from a scientific standpoint, again, and we can't just say science, we have to say biocentrism, because mainstream science is not on board this, although we spend endless chapters showing that yes, it is. It's just not realizing that it is. So that if time and space don't exist, which we show that it doesn't, how can there be something, after death? You're talking about an after. Where could you go? Where could you possibly dissipate? And not only that, but the energy, which is that the consciousness is, can't just go to zero. And so through many different, I'm not being particularly articulate here, but through many different areas, we show that there simply is no experience of death. It simply doesn't happen. Now, since you asked me a question, I'll tell you, as the co-author of this book, something that happened to me when I was just 20 and still in college, actually, an experience that later on I understood was called, and has been called through the ages, samadhi or satori or realization or enlightenment, or it just happened to me spontaneously, and no drugs were involved. Just happened spontaneously and lasted for 3 weeks, during which time I had no thoughts in my mind, and clearly saw, and this was with great joy and total peace, that death doesn't exist. There is no birth and death. It's an illusion. And I could also conclude that the universe is perfect, that there's nothing to get to, there's nothing to strive towards, and that it is, just like they say in the East, it is one. Afterward, coming back into being a person with a mind again, if you ask me to explain what do you mean by all is one, that the universe is one? What do you mean that there's no death? How can you be sure? I couldn't even begin to tell you with words, but the experience was so certain, because certainty was part and parcel of it, absolute certainty. I mean, beyond anything I could have imagined. I mean, you think, if you hold out your car keys and open your hands, you expect that they'll drop to the ground. That's that kind of intellectual certainty, that gravity will always work. But this is like to your bones certainty. It's like a recognition. It's not like learning something new. It's like recognizing something that you always knew, and then it's like with great joy and gratitude and all the rest. So this flavored my whole life, and so this book is a combination of the science behind it, because I think that's what our readers want. They don't want just more Eastern philosophy where you trust a high being to tell you that that's how it is, or that's what you should believe. We're saying that this is what, because my co-author never had such an experience and comes to it strictly through science. He's a medical doctor. In fact, he's one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. He was in last year's front page of Time. So he comes to it strictly through science, biological science. So that's really the direction that we're aiming here, showing that what science is really telling us is identical with what the sages have really said for the thousands of years.
So what I'd kind of like to get from this too is that, I mean, I've read the book, and it's I encourage all of our listeners to check it out because it's a fascinating book, precisely for what you're saying. It brings a lot of science into, especially for those that are interested in Eastern philosophy. It draws a lot of connections between cutting edge science and this philosophy that has been around for thousands of years. But my question is, with the book and the work that you do, what's the big, like, so what moment? Like, with this information, how can we utilize this understanding to enrich our lives or to transform the way that we interact with our environment now? Like, how do we shift this amazing understanding into like a practical utility for everyday living?
Well, I think first have the understanding, either through the book or by some other means, and then see what happens to you. I think the first thing will happen is a great relaxation. You won't be puzzled and tormented by the questions that everybody seems to have about the nature of the universe, and is Earth going to get destroyed eventually either by ourselves or by a comet hitting us, and all the worries that people have. I think those go away right away. And most importantly, seeing that nature and the individual or consciousness is correlative just makes you enjoy, at least that's what it does for me. It makes you really enjoy everything you see in every moment in life. It's very hard to get uptight by coffee spilling, let's say, when you really see that the coffee is only spilling within your brain. And it's all like a fascinating stuff. It's just fascinating. I mean, life is amazing.
It is absolutely amazing. What one thing that I always get, and this is more of a personal question than anything else, but when I hear the kind of like, well, it allows us to relax into the universe and things of that nature, I agree entirely, but my concern then is a sense of apathy towards the world. And obviously, I mean, you've authored a number of books, you're active in the community, you really share science with the world. So you're not apathetic. You're not like, oh, the world's just going to do what it's going to do and it doesn't matter. You're still really actively engaged with, which I love and commend. How do we translate that relaxed experience and understanding of the universe into engagement still with the universe?
Well, I think that happens spontaneously. Perhaps the biggest disagreement I have with my co-author is he believes in free will and I don't. Like, I see our individual actions as happening spontaneously. So if you come across someone who needs help in some way, you may be either moved to help them, maybe it involves time or financial or what have you, or you won't be moved to help them. It'll be sort of according to the vibe. I'm going to use Woodstock language here because I live only a few miles away from Woodstock. And so things unfold. I mean, even now as I'm speaking to you, I have no idea what I'm going to say 3 sentences from now. Obviously, they're just coming out. It's unfolding, and my experience over my life is that everything happens that way, and that people who assume that there's free will and they control things, I think that's illusory. Again, my co-author says no, and that's why we left that out of the book entirely. It's appropriate only now in answering your question, Ashton, because you say, what do you then do with it and how do you act? Well, you'll act as you'll act.
So is that following a what we could call intuition, or how would you describe what that sensation or that experience is of, I mean, being it sounds like, we're being guided to something or led to something. Is that coming from, if that's coming from past experience or past samskaras, then that would be that conversation for time again. So how does that kind of fit into the dialogue?
Well, I don't see it as time as sort of an unfolding. Like, for example, if a cloud is forming, would we say that there was some prearrangement involved there? Would we say the cloud had free will? No, we'd say no, the cloud didn't have free will. Well, what about, is there predestiny? Was it predestined that the cloud should take that shape? I think most of us would say no, not really. So what's left, both with the cloud and with our own lives? What's left if it's neither predestined nor do we have our finger on every little typing key and arrange everything in our lives? What's the other choice? And to me, that other choice is a kind of spontaneous unfolding of every moment, quite marvelous, where we're moved to do things, say things, act in a certain way, behave in a certain way, and it happens quite on its own, as trustworthy a manner as clouds form or the whole animal kingdom acts. Mm-hmm. So, all this business of what should we do, what will happen, these are all unnecessary questions. They actually just get in the way, because it is going to happen, and this is not some kind of hopeless, there's nothing we can do about it. I think Earth is quite all right. Nothing bad is going to happen, especially, when you see that there's no death. Nothing bad is going to happen. It's all unfolding, and but seeing it, the difference between having a viewpoint that incorporates nature and the individual, and not seeing us as at war with our circumstances and our environment, confronting it, having to deal with it, but rather being part and parcel of it, of course, causes a relaxation and a different worldview that can only benefit.
Well, I don't know if you consider yourself a yogi, Bob, but I would definitely say that you sound a whole lot like a yogi. So I really appreciate the things that you say. Where can people find out more about you and the work that you do, or connect to your radio show or in your books? Where's the best place to get a hold of you?
Well, I do have a website, skymanbob.com, that I update very neglectfully. It's probably 4 months out of date, but at least it's there, listing some of the talks I give and books I write. So I guess that would be a place, skymanbob.com.
Right. Awesome. And then for our listeners too, be sure to check out Beyond Biocentrism, with Bob Berman, and his co-author is Robert Lanza, if we haven't actually said that before. But it's a fascinating book, especially if you're into Eastern philosophy. It adds a lot of science that parallels what is being discussed in those conversations and dialogues quite a bit. So it is a really amazing read. Bob, thank you so much for being on the show. I appreciate your insights and your intellect and everything you shared with us today.
A pleasure, Ashton, really. Thanks for having me on.
And for all our listeners out there, thank you so much for listening. I'm sure that you've learned something today. I hope you've enjoyed our chat, and I hope you all have a very present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the show today. Please go over to iTunes, write a review, let us know what you think. It helps us in creating new content for all of you. It also helps new listeners get a sense of what to expect from the show. We really appreciate your feedback. Thanks again for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.